Hello and welcome to this Infrastructure Victoria webinar on adapting infrastructure in Victoria to climate change. I'm Jonathan Spear, CEO of Infrastructure Victoria. I'm really pleased that you're joining us today as we unpack our latest research, and that's called Weathering the Storm, and it focuses on real practical ways we can start to make steps to adapt our infrastructure to the growing effects of climate change. I'm really pleased to be joined today as well by two of my colleagues. I have with me Llewellyn Reynders, Director of Research and Policy at Infrastructure Victoria, and Caroline Evans, who's a Principal Policy Officer with us, Infrastructure Victoria, and they've led a lot of this work and they are going to be taking us through many of the findings as well. Now, later on, after we've taken you through our research and findings and recommendations, we're going to open things up for your questions. So you'll see beneath the stream that you can see us on, the Slido function. So there you can put in your questions, but also you can vote on the questions that other people have put into the Slido chat. And later on, I'll be asking Caroline and Llewellyn about those questions. So please feel free to keep them coming through from now on. And we're really looking forward to engaging with your questions later in the webinar. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting. We're in the Infrastructure Victorian offices on Naarm, also known as Melbourne, and so this is Wurundjeri country, and I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the lands and any elders past, present, who are joining us today as well. Now, you're probably familiar with Infrastructure Victoria, but for those of you who aren't, we are the state's independent infrastructure advisor. We give rigorous, independent, evidence-based advice to the Victorian Government and Victorian Parliament. And we do that through three main ways. We have a 30-year infrastructure strategy. We do research that's designed to shape policy and investments, and we also give advice to the government when it's requested. And that's quite good context then for why we've undertaken this work on climate change adaptation. So in our 2021 version of the 30-year infrastructure strategy, we identified the need for a strategic review of the effects that climate change might have on the Victoria infrastructure. And what we've done then is taken upon ourselves through our research function to dive deeper then, to do an assessment of what those risks might be and also give guidance as to what some of the practical measures might be, the real priorities, so Victorian Government departments and agencies to start to engage with those growing challenges that we're having from the real effects of climate change. So that's why we undertook this research, Weathering the Storm. Now with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Caroline to take us through some of how we did the research and the findings.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. A key challenge is that our infrastructure was not built for the more frequent and severe weather events which are occurring as a result of climate change. Infrastructure is now being exposed to greater challenges from bushfires, floods, landslides, and also storm surges. And if we don't take more action now, our infrastructure will fail more often. And this will cause more disruptions to the community, to businesses, more harm to each of these, and it will also increase the cost of recovery. So this is why early adaptation action can in fact reduce the risk of damages. And through our work, we've identified that there is a real opportunity for the Victorian Government to step up our adaptive actions to keep Victorians safer and to also reduce the costs of recovery. And our work gives government the tools to assess options to make infrastructure more resilient when these events do occur. So first of all, we looked at the context of climate change, and some climate change is already locked in. Victorians are already paying the cost of a changing climate, and these impacts are really being felt in real time. Australia is warming, and how much further it warms will really depend on the speed of global action to reduce emissions. Now, because extreme weather events are hitting our infrastructure more frequently and more intensely, our recovery bill is really high. Recovering from our extreme weather events is costing Victoria about $3 billion every year. And for every dollar government spend on recovery, they are only spending 3 cents on prevention. So there is a real opportunity here to do more with our investment. Now, I'll just briefly take you through our research method. We do have a supplementary report which is outlining our research method in further detail, and I really encourage you to have a look at this further. Now, we undertook 3 main phases for our project, and it's useful to think about this like a funnel, where we started with identifying the broad statewide risks, and then we provided more detail on specific sectors as we went through the project. So in the first phase of the project, we undertook a review of the policies and the methods. We spoke with governments and other jurisdictions, and we looked at the broad statewide climate change risks for a range of different types of sectors, such as the transport sector, utilities, built environment, and we also looked at how these interrelated between each other. Out of this phase, we came out with a list of different types of risks across these sectors. And then we took this into the second phase of the project, which is where we narrowed down the analysis to identify the highest climate change risks for Victoria and infrastructure in more detail. So in this stage, we undertook a geospatial mapping exercise where we looked at the exposure of different types of risks such as floods and also bushfire risks across regions in the state. In particular, we also looked at the vulnerability of assets such as hospitals, roads, electricity infrastructure, and at the end of this stage, we identified a range of different adaptation solutions that could be applied to reduce these high risks identified. In the third phase of the project, we evaluated the economic case for adaptation action. And it's in this stage where we really wanted to assess what are some of the adaptation options which can be used to assess the highest risks, and how do these stack up in a cost-benefit analysis. So we looked at 3 hypothetical examples, and these were centred around two sectors. These were the road sector and also the electricity sector. Now, in this stage, we also demonstrated a new method that could be applied to incorporate climate change more deeply into a cost-benefit analysis. And this could be through a repeated approach that could be applied to different sectors, different infrastructure types, and also different locations. Now, out of all of this research, we came out with some really interesting findings, and I'll now hand you across to Llewellyn to talk more about these.
Fantastic. Thank you, Caroline. And again, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Llewellyn Rangers. I'm a Director of Research and Policy, and I've been working with Caroline for the last 2 years on this project, and we're really excited to talk more about it today. So the first thing we wanted to talk about was really what do we mean when we say adapt infrastructure? And I think people often go to, how do we make it harder? How do we make it stronger? But what our research found is actually there's many different ways and many different options and techniques we can use to adapt our infrastructure to a changing climate. So one often very valuable mechanism is to actually just maintain the infrastructure better. And what we find is that if we let our infrastructure deteriorate and, let the maintenance and repairs get away from us a little bit, it's a lot less resilient when a climate event or an extreme weather event comes along. We can also look at ways of reducing the impact of those risks, whether it's the impact of a flood or the impact of trees falling. We can look at managing the risks around the infrastructure to actually help reduce the impact on it. we can retrofit and upgrade infrastructure to make it harder or to actually maybe make it more flexible or able to be repaired quicker after damage. We can use different designs when we're building new infrastructure, and we can look at ways that we can use materials or the design techniques of building the infrastructure so that it is more resilient to the events we're identifying. And finally, we can also look at where we're building infrastructure. In some cases, it might even be worthwhile to relocate infrastructure, and certainly when we're building new infrastructure, we can think about the best places to put it. Our second major finding was really understanding that often the risks to our infrastructure are very localised and very much depend on what type of infrastructure it is and what type of climate risk might affect it. And so we can't make generic statements about, well, infrastructure, the biggest risk to infrastructure is bushfire. It kind of depends where the infrastructure is, what type it is, and how different extreme weather events, for example, will affect that infrastructure. And what that means is when the approach we need to take is a little more considered. We need to think about what type of infrastructure we're managing, if we're an infrastructure manager, and which locations it's particularly exposed to climate risks. We need to then really look at that location and be able to assess quite specifically in that site what's likely to happen to infrastructure, how might the climate risk affect the infrastructure, and then we can turn to, well, how do we look for different options and solutions that might improve the resilience of infrastructure in that specific place. And when we compare those different options, and particularly doing some analysis that we might talk through in a moment, then we can really look at which option will perform best for that infrastructure type to that climate risk in that place. And those answers might be different for different types of infrastructure for different locations. And finally, our third biggest finding, and we'll talk about this a bit more in some of our recommendations, is that we can get better as a government and as a community at adapting our infrastructure to climate change if we provide some guide rails for how to do it, what information to use and what process to use. And some of the things we've found through our research is really that infrastructure managers could be supported better to make these decisions, including in techniques that they can use to build the case to persuade governments to invest in adaptation, and particularly trying to shift government expenditure from not only recovering from extreme weather events and disasters, but actually investing upfront to adapt the infrastructure before crisis hits. We can give them better support and advice on how to prioritise different adaptation measures, and using some of the processes we'll talk about a little bit more. And finally, we think there's very much a role for giving people good information that's really easy to use and is really designed for them to be able to use easily. And this can include data on climate projections or on the particular impacts on infrastructure that an extreme weather event might cause. But we're going to take you through some of the examples we did in our research to illustrate this kind of process. And I'm going to hand over to Carolyn to talk you through the first couple of case studies.
Thanks very much, Llewellyn. So in our work, we analysed the costs and benefits of a number of different types of adaptation solutions. All up, we looked at 20 different types of adaptation measures, and we analysed these through hypothetical examples that were based on real-world data. For our first example, we looked at a flood-prone road. So this specifically was looking at the damages to roads as a result of floods in an urban area. For our second example, we looked at a bushfire impacted road, and in particular this was focusing on the accessibility of a road in a region as a result of bushfires and subsequent landslide events. For our third example, we looked at a wind-exposed electricity distribution network, and this was focused in an urban area and was mainly looking at the impacts of wind events on our electricity distribution. Now, I'll just take you through some of these findings. So first of all, for a flood-prone road, we showed that it is really possible to deliver positive returns on investment, and some of these actually cost very little. So we showed through our work that there are real benefits of investing in resilient infrastructure, and these can outweigh the cost of repairing and rebuilding after events. So I wanted to focus on two particular adaptation measures which really stood out. These were preventative maintenance and also foam bitumen stabilisation techniques. Now, both of these produce the highest return on investment under both current and also future conditions. Now, preventative maintenance, this involves increasing your inspection frequencies for early intervention to avoid more costly repairs. And foam bitumen stabilisation is found to be a really good measure to help improve the strength of the roads as a result of floods. Now, both of these are being applied in some parts of Victoria, and it's through the results that we've received which really provide an indication for governments to think about considering these more. Now, I'll just take you through the bushfire impacted road. So with this example, we came out with some really interesting results where increased program maintenance produced over 5 times the return on investment. So it's just doing really small interventions such as clearing the drains and maintaining the vegetation around the drains that can actually produce a really big result. When looking across our other bushfire adaptation measures, we found that positive returns on investment were really centred around those lower cost adaptation solutions, such as maintenance activities or hazard management options. Now, another aspect that we looked at in our work was where adaptation measures can be combined together, and they can also be put in place in a sequenced way where they can be constantly adjusted over time to the changing weather conditions and changing information. So, for example, planting new vegetation and clearing drains after a fire, these measures can be bundled together to increase their effectiveness and help stabilise slopes and minimise erosion and subsequent landslides. Now, we did a similar type of analysis with our electricity distribution networks, and I'll hand you across to Llewellyn to speak more about these. Thank you.
Fantastic, thanks Carolyn. And look, our final example that we looked at was a case study of an electricity distribution feeder line. And for those of you who don't know what that is, which I didn't when I started this work, it's kind of the intermediate level electricity wire, not the one that joins to your house, not the giant towers that cross the state, but there's a middle level high voltage wire that kind of connects the local network to the electricity substations. And we looked at 4 different ways we could adapt to the effects of extreme wind and storms on those lines being affected and causing power outages. The first one was insulating the cables using a technique called aerial bundle cables, where basically we use plastic coated wires and we kind of bundle the wires together to make them more secure. We also looked at replacing the trees, so actually removing any large trees that might fall on the wires and replace them with shrubs or shorter trees. We looked at undergrounding the cables, and we also looked at requiring people who installed solar panels to also install what's called a grid-forming inverter, which is a special piece of technology which basically allows them to run off their solar energy if the power goes out. And as you can see from the slide, that the insulated cables actually returned the best return on investment and cost-benefit ratio. of all of the different examples we tested, and at a 4% discount, it returned a benefit cost ratio of 1.16. But part of the utility of these examples is we kind of wanted to demonstrate how this process worked, and this process can be applied well beyond these kind of road or electricity systems, but you can apply it to other types of infrastructure as well. So we've also come up with, as a result of our research, 7 kind of main recommendations for the Victorian Government, which we think can actually help government start the process of adapting its infrastructure and ultimately keeping Victorians safer, keeping businesses running, and having a positive benefit to the community in the face of climate change that's already locked in. The first of those recommendations is to build on the adaptation action plans the Victorian Government already has in place. And, one thing we did in this research is really look at how we can use existing systems, and rather than inventing whole new systems to make infrastructure more resilient, we're actually looking at adapting and using the systems we've already got to help us achieve that task. So in terms of the existing adaptation action plans, we really saw that infrastructure could be more visible in those plans. For example, the climate change strategy kind of mentions infrastructure resilience in passing, but it's really not highlighted or a particular priority identified for government. We also noted, particularly building on some of the electricity sector work, that there is no specific electricity adaptation action plan, and we think that is probably a priority area the Victorian Government can look at in the future, rather than just bundling it up with the built environment more generally. The second recommendation, we really thought it was useful to provide particularly infrastructure managers with really good, agreed, common data points that they can use to analyse their infrastructure. So, for example, having an agreed probability of extreme wind in the future in Victoria. What we see at the moment is not a lack of data, but actually we're awash with data. We're awash with projections and scenarios, and actually this is really hard for a lot of people to wade through if they're not an expert climate scientist. And instead, if we can give people a simple, clear estimate that is based on the best science but might have to be updated from time to time, people can start plugging those estimates into their analysis and draw conclusions far more easily. The third recommendation we made was actually turning our asset management system to really incorporate climate resilience. And we see, while climate change is kind of mentioned in passing in some of our asset management guidance, a lot more could be added to that to give clarity to infrastructure managers about how to build climate resilience into their asset management practice, and to be able to follow easily guidance on how to do that. Fourthly, we thought climate change and climate change adaptation could be built much better into government risk management frameworks. So every agency in the Victorian Government has a risk management process, but our risk management process in the Victorian Government doesn't actually list specific risks for agencies to manage. They allow agencies to identify those themselves. What we think is, obviously any agency with a major infrastructure portfolio probably needs to be identifying climate change as a risk to their agency, and could benefit from guidance on how to consider that, how to respond to that, and how to adapt their infrastructure over time. The fifth recommendation we made was really building climate adaptation and climate change risks into our financial management and in consideration of our financial risks. We unearthed a lot of evidence in our research that actually the damage from climate change comes at great cost not only to government but to communities and businesses. And we're not thinking through necessarily the full impacts of those on the state government's finances and the broader economy. So by bringing climate change into our financial risk disclosures, and particularly doing that at an agency level and not only a whole of government level, could give agencies much more detail and prompt them to consider these financial risks to their organisations more deeply. The sixth recommendation we made was really thinking about when we are making the case for major investment, that we are building in a consideration of climate resilience and climate risks. And much of our business case guidance and our investment guidance doesn't have much detail on how to do that. And we think much of the work that we've laid out in this report can be brought into those kind of frameworks to, again, give guidance to agencies about how to prepare business cases that deeply consider climate risks. And our final recommendation is based on a lot of feedback we had through this process, that often agencies weren't really convinced that funding was going to be available to implement the options they assessed as being best and could deliver a good return on investment. And while we have some adaptation action plans in place, we observed that they weren't accompanied by significant investment to implement them. And we think there's an opportunity in the next round of adaptation action plans in 2026 for the government to invest alongside those to make sure that there is funding available for any major investments that are required to adapt to climate change. And we see examples around the world of this process. For example, both in New Zealand and in Canada, those governments have put together a climate adaptation fund that actually allows agencies to bid for major investment to ensure their infrastructure is adapted. Thanks for your time. I'm handing back to Jonathan to just sum up, and we might move to questions after that.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Llewellyn and Caroline. So, we've been through the methodology, the findings and the recommendations. What I'd really recommend you do is jump on our website, because you can find a lot more detail there. There is a full report that really gets into much more detail that digs in beneath what we've just been presenting to you about methodology and approach and findings and recommendations. There's also an even more detailed methodology report about how we've done this work so that you and your organisations can seek to replicate some of this work in your specific context. And we've got our consultant reports, which give more detail on how we did the risk assessment and also how we did those economic assessments that Llewellyn and Caroline have just taken you through. I know some of you are interested in copies of the slides for this webinar. There'll be a recording of the webinar that'll be available in around the next 24 hours as well, so you can see this and watch for your viewing pleasure over and over again this webinar. So we've got some great questions coming through on the Slido. Thanks very much. Keep those coming and keep on voting for those questions that you'd like to have me answer and ask, more importantly, to Llewellyn and Caroline. A lot of the questions we've got that are coming through are around, well, where do we prioritise? How do we actually take those steps of risk assessment? And I'll read verbatim one of these questions, and I think that's a really good place for us to sort of start to dig into. So the question is, while the report emphasises that the economic case for adaptation options are not one size fits all, is there a general rule of thumb for applying these adaptation solutions, say, to all roads that are subject to flooding? Is there like a total asset value? So how do we do this prioritisation? How do we take this from the general principles? We can't do everything everywhere all at once. So what's the report saying about that level of prioritisation?
Sure, I will jump in there. Thanks, Jonathan. And look, we were really mindful that, you know, we certainly looked at options to, you know, that people have suggested, for example, there should be a climate standard and we should have a new level of, you know, intensity or resilience for all roads or for all power lines. And we think that could actually be really expensive. So part of how we came to our conclusions was actually to think about how do we prioritise where we spend money to get the best bang for our buck. So rather than kind of having a general view about use this type of intervention everywhere, we can be much targeted and get much better value for money if we go through this process of identifying where are the places at greatest climate risk, what are the options in those locations that are going to deliver the best value for money. And while that is a bit more work and it's a bit more time consuming, it will ultimately lead to better value for money, better investment of public money or of business money, and allow us to actually get the outcomes we're achieving at far lower cost.
And just in addition to that as well, I wanted to mention that with our economic analysis, we looked at a number of different features, and incorporated into this was maladaptation. So this is of the understanding that not all solutions will be applicable in every single location. It's not a cookie cutter approach that we're adopting here. So as part of our economic analysis, we did factor in considerations of maladaptation, where some measures might work in some locations and where they might not work in others. So for example, increasing roadside vegetation to reduce the impacts from flood events and water runoff from roads. This could actually increase a bushfire risk in other locations. So these were some of the factors that we also considered as part of our economic analysis.
Yeah, great, thank you. And so what we might do now is also dig into another question that's been asked about prioritisation. Some of you are probably familiar with the concept of critical infrastructure, which has been around, it's in Commonwealth legislation. And so, Llewellyn, maybe can I ask you to dig into this one a bit? We are obviously talking about prioritisation of adaptation efforts. Does that sit at all with the concept of critical infrastructure, or is it a separate idea? Is there any sort of overlap between the critical infrastructure concept and prioritisation for adaptation of infrastructure to climate change?
Look, I think there is considerable overlap, but I think we would also emphasise that a lot of our process and our work can apply to infrastructure beyond that which is classed as critical infrastructure. So obviously the structures of government have different ways of categorising infrastructure, and indeed the critical infrastructure designation has identified, particular infrastructure types that are critical for the operations of business and the community and government to operate, and need particular consideration in resilience. The process that we've outlined actually allows for us to consider the impact of infrastructure failure and the size of that impact and the consequences of that impact, which I would expect as a general principle would likely be higher for critical infrastructure than some others. Nonetheless, it is not necessarily always the case that a failure of some other type of infrastructure wouldn't benefit from an upgrade or wouldn't have a major effect on communities. So I think that's a short way of saying absolutely critical infrastructure should be adapted to climate change, and these type of assessments should be undertaken for it. But we can extend that beyond critical infrastructure and look at other types of infrastructure too.
Great, thanks, Llewellyn. We've also got some questions coming through about the scale of the challenge, and Caroline, you talked a bit about the impacts that we're already experiencing from extreme weather events and the way in which we have to spend quite a lot of money on recovery from those incidents. Some of the questions are coming through about what's the mix, what's the split, how much of money are we spending on recovery and how much is being reinvested so we are more resilient and more adaptive?
Thanks very much. So this is a really important question. I feel it was touched on in one of my earlier slides, actually, where we are paying spending about $3 billion per year on recovery. So there is a real opportunity to shift the balance here. We spoke to a lot of infrastructure managers, and they were saying that, you know, resources are finite, also finances are finite as well, and it's really difficult to have that focus on prevention activities because we're tending to spend a lot of emphasis on the recovery side of things. So there is a real opportunity to shift the dial a bit with where we spend our investments towards more prevention type activities. And this is where we can, in fact, by doing this, increase the resilience of our network and then bring down some of these costs of recovery when these events do occur, because we can't stop the events from occurring, but we can reduce the recovery costs by having more investment in the prevention activities. And it's through our research where we have identified that there are some lower cost options that can be put in place to help with this.
Thanks, Caroline. So there's obviously opportunities to rebalance to some degree the investments that we're making. Now, we've also got some questions coming through that relate to the recommendations that Llewellyn, you talked about on the quality of data that's available to inform decision makings. And so what would be great is if we could dig into a little bit more about the findings there. So questions are like, is there consolidated data sets that exist already that we can start to access now? And how authoritative are the data sets that are available to infrastructure managers and planners?
So look, there is data, and the Department of Environment, Energy and Climate Action does have some really good resources, which is a great starting place. One of the things we observed is often there is reasonable projections of, for example, average temperature increase, and it's often linked to various projections of how much climate change occurs. What isn't necessarily there is a kind of point estimate or a middle point, our best guess, and a figure that we can kind of say, look, this is the agreed government figure, which we think infrastructure managers should use to do climate assessments. Often there's a range of figures and it's not really clear which one you should use, which climate model you should use, and we observe that not everyone's necessarily picking the same number. Secondly, there isn't necessarily great data on some of the extreme weather events that we've assessed in this report. So when we're talking about what has some of the biggest risks to infrastructure, it's things like floods, it's things like extreme wind, it's things like bushfires. And the prevalence and future probability of those events, it doesn't necessarily have great estimates in the climate data. And the third data element, I guess, is the localised data. So sometimes we can get relatively good and clear projections about how it might affect a very large area or the whole state. How it affects a particular area and a particular site can sometimes be quite difficult to get information on. So they're the kind of three areas we think there could be much better data worked on from government. But there is data already out there, and none of that should prevent infrastructure managers from beginning to interrogate these questions already.
Thanks very much, Llewellyn. And we had a follow-up question around that in terms of, well, who should be the custodian of that data, and is there an opportunity to nationalise the data that's available? And of course your point, I think, in part is, well, we've got a lot of it there already. It's about picking which ones we use and having some consistency. Is that right? Absolutely.
And look, we would certainly welcome, whether it's at a state level or a national level, consistent data. I guess, Victoria manages and owns quite a lot of its own infrastructure. It may well have its own views about what agreed number it wishes to pursue, because this is not only a question of climate science, it's a question of risk, it's a question of impact, and they may vary from location to location. Nonetheless, if national agreement can be reached, that is certainly very, very welcome. In the first instance, it's entirely in control of the Victorian Government to establish these agreed metrics for Victoria on its own initiative.
Great, thanks, Llewellyn. And now, of course, this research is targeted to the Victorian Government and its infrastructure. But Caroline, it'd be great to hear from you a bit about local government infrastructure as well. Because, of course, local governments have lots of infrastructure that is really important to the community. They have to maintain it. It's affected by extreme weather events too. So how relevant are these findings and recommendations to local governments?
Thanks for the question. I would say that they're extremely relevant to local government. There are so many different types of impacts that local governments are experiencing as a result of climate change events. We only have to go out onto our roads and there are potholes, there are lots of things that need to be maintained. So there is a real opportunity for local governments to also look at the guidance that we've put together, our toolkit that we've put together, which is going through how do we identify the highest risks, how do we identify which parts across the network are vulnerable, how do we identify different types of adaptation options to implement and then cost these out. We did draw on some local government data as well when we were putting together our economic analysis for electricity and also for the road sector. And I think that there is a real opportunity for this sort of material to be used for local governments and to reduce the impacts of climate change and improve the resilience of their networks.
Yeah, absolutely, Caroline. I'd certainly endorse that and really encourage our local government colleagues to take the methodologies and approaches that we've demonstrated in this research and apply it to your infrastructure as well. Of course, there's all sorts of jurisdictions that are facing effects of climate change on the infrastructure. And Llewellyn, you started to talk about some of these earlier in terms of some of the examples we're seeing overseas. You talked about Canada and New Zealand having climate adaptation funds. When we look around the world, where are some of the places, what are some of the other good examples where we can take some of their work and reapply it here?
Oh, look, there are so many examples of really interesting reactions and responses by government. The one that immediately comes to mind, having just spoken about climate data, is actually an example in Ireland, where they've set up a bespoke unit to work with climate data users to actually make their data really intelligible and really easy to use. And we can, see the analogy with potentially the Victorian Government to take that approach of actually working with data users to understand what they need to use the data for and what kinds of data and what kind of estimates are really going to add value to their work and allow them to engage in better adaptation over time.
And just also to add to that, if I could, we used a lot of international knowledge in our research. So particularly with our economic assessment, we looked at what was happening internationally. So with our economic assessment, we've built in a lot of really interesting concepts like adaptation pathways. There is a lot of uncertainty around climate change, and this comes into the sequencing of different adaptation measures over time as more information emerges. We also built in maladaptation, as I mentioned earlier. Also, embodied emissions was another factor that we incorporated into our analysis, looking at the amount of emissions that are produced when implementing the adaptation measures. We also looked at the direct and indirect costs and benefits and built this into our economic assessment. And we're seeing pieces of work around the these areas being done internationally. And what we've done in our work is we've bundled them all together into our cost-benefit analysis.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon and Llewellyn. And what I really encourage you to do, if you want to dive into our report, you will see some of those examples from around the world. But it's also just north of the border. There's some good examples of what New South Wales are doing and some of the ways that they do risk assessment guidance for climate change risks. Some other questions that are coming through that I might put to you, Caroline, relate to how do you deal with multiple risks? And how do you avoid maladaptation? And I know you're passionate about avoiding maladaptation. So, for example, a question is, well, what if a road faces both flood and fire risk? And in eliminating, say, the vegetation to avoid the fire risk, you might end up with greater flood risk. So talk us through how we work through multiple risks. Maybe explain what maladaptation is and how we can avoid that too.
Yeah, thanks very much. So maladaptation is where there are unintended consequences as a result of putting a particular measure or a number of measures in place. So in terms of dealing with multiple different types of events, we actually looked at this in a number of places throughout our analysis. So we looked at it in our risk assessment, where we looked at the cascading effects. So these are the effects that can occur as a flow-on. So if the power lines come down, then that could cause power outages, but also potentially a fire. So these are the types of cascading effects that we looked at when assessing our high risks to Victoria, and those that we wanted to analyse into further detail. Llewellyn, do you have some more that you would like to add about that?
Well, look, and I guess just, on some of the, how do you actually process that in assessment? Certainly one thing we did was actually look at, well, what are those detrimental effects, and built them into our cost-benefit analysis. So if we looked at an option to, say, protect a road against bushfire, we could consider, well, what is the chance that would increase the risk of landslip? What would the cost of that damage be? And then be able to kind of do the economic assessment of, well, then what is the return on the investment of that option? Understanding and building in any negative effects of that action as well. So sometimes those kinds of things can be picked up in a cost-benefit analysis, considering both the positive and negative consequences of any adaptation option.
Great, thank you. And Caroline, you touched on interdependencies and some of those that we face between different infrastructure types and different risks. I think it'd be useful because there's questions coming through about, well, how do you manage and prioritise action and how do you deal with interdependencies? So, of course, we did look at this when we did the initial risk assessment that got us to looking at those road and electricity distribution risks. Maybe draw out some more of that about the way in which some infrastructure types have bigger network effects or interdependencies than others.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the interdependencies, we looked at a number of sectors. So I mentioned earlier that in our second phase of our project, we focused around electricity, also roads and hospitals. And what we found when we were doing the risk analysis, that there were interdependencies where if the roads were not available, then that then impacted on the ability to get to hospital and emergency services. Similarly, if there were power outages and the roads were closed, then there were factors that we looked at where there were impacts then on the ability to repair the power lines that were down because the roads were closed. So we looked at these types of interdependencies when we were assessing what are our highest risks that we wanted to then take into the next phase of the project, which was the economic assessment, and then deciding on what type of adaptation measures can be applicable to assess not only the risks for the sector that we were looking at, but also had implications for other sectors.
Thanks, Caroline. Now, it's great to see you all voting up and the questions that you would like us to be asking, so I'm going to have to make sure I get to those. So there's a very popular question, which I might put to you, Llewellyn. Are there tools already available to asset managers currently to help them assess climate change risk and adaptation solutions?
So yes, and in fact there's many tools, and I think part of the challenge here is sorting through which one to use in which instance. And it's part of the reason, I guess, we've really encouraged the Victorian Government to set out its preferred approach, to kind of set out what kind of approach they think is most useful in which circumstances, because one of the challenges in this space, and I think it's been coming through some of the questions, is it can be very easy to get paralysed, right? There's so much information, so much content, and in fact what we think would really help improve that situation is if there is some guidance and there is some instruction on here is the way that the Victorian Government does it, use this methodology, and that will be generally accepted by government, and that will be consistent with what other agencies are doing, and also the outcomes of those assessments can be meaningfully compared. So yes, agencies can get on and find and use many of the tools out there, and I think we found at least 30 or 40 different tools, but nonetheless I think over time we really want to see that consistency and comparability of approach adopted and promulgated across the government.
And just to add to that, one of the features of our work was that with our recommendations, we selected ways to embed climate change more into our policies and also our existing sets of guidelines. So we've suggested to add on to existing sets of guidelines through Department of Treasury and Finance, for example, with the business case assessments, to incorporate climate change more into these sort of materials. So we don't want to add to the resourcing requirements to develop new sets of guidelines. It's really adding on to what is already there.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline and Llewellyn. So really, I think it's probably fair to say, given that there's so many existing tools and data sets, what our research does is it gives governments a bit of a playbook about how to bring all of that together so that there is a consistent way to assess risks, assess options, and then make really good investment decisions. The other question that's been coming through is another one around availability of data, which I might put to you, Caroline, a really popular question about is there a consolidated spatial data set of Victoria's critical infrastructure that we can start accessing now?
There are consolidated data sets that are available. So Llewellyn actually mentioned a couple of these materials. So in terms of climate change data, there is the Victorian Futures tool, which is a really good tool that we actually used for assessing in our geospatial analysis and also our risk assessments. So yes, there is quite a lot of really useful material out there. As Llewellyn was saying, with the challenge around data is that there is a lot of data, and it's really a matter of sorting through how to use this data, and by having more consistent data available, this can then flow through into our risk assessments to create more consistent results there.
Right, thanks, Caroline. Yeah. Another question that's come through has been about the role of insurance. And Llewellyn, you talked about the various options we have in terms of building back or various other adaptation options. So tell us a bit more about the role that insurance can play. We have, of course, the Victoria Managed Insurance Authority that deals with a lot of the state government's assets. What are the opportunities for insurance to play a role in not just rebuilding things exactly the way they were before they got flooded or burnt?
Yeah, and look, there's two parts to that question, or two parts to the answer, in that, I guess, firstly, part of the thrust of the research and the recommendations is actually thinking about how do we prevent rather than recover and rebuild. So, to some of the earlier comments, how do we shift some of the focus from what do we do after stuff has been damaged or knocked out, and actually thinking about what do we do before that happens. But to your point, I think we are very cognizant of some of the issues, both about, I guess, contractual requirements, but also the cost of insurance and the relationship between those things. In an ideal world, you would build back better. But we're also aware that that can be expensive, it may not be covered by insurance, and it may be required at a time when labour and materials is very short because an area has just been hit by a major event or disaster. So yes, there is more that insurance can do. There is more thinking we can do about how to manage both government insurance as well as interact with private insurance companies to do this better and to recover from disasters better. But I think we also need to think about, well, how do we reduce the amount of damage that might be caused in the first place, or make our infrastructure so that it is far easier and cheaper to recover from any climate event, rather than only focus on what happens afterwards.
Great, thank you, Llewellyn. Now, we've only got a few minutes left. We could talk about climate adaptation all day, as you can probably tell. We've got some great questions coming through. You'll see on your screens near the Slido chat also a poll coming up. We would love to hear from you. There's just some simple questions about this webinar and any other suggestions you have for future webinars that Infrastructure Victoria runs. So if you could take a few moments before we close to fill in that poll, we'd really appreciate that. We've got time probably just for another question. And Caroline, I know there's a lot of interest in things like foam bitumen stabilisation and aerial bundled cables that we've talked about. Tell us a little bit more about what are these things, and perhaps as importantly, to what extent are they already being deployed in Victoria and around Australia? Are these proven solutions, and what's the degree of their deployment?
Yeah. Thanks for the question. So these are actually being applied in Victoria, in some parts of Victoria, but also in other parts of Australia as well. So foam bitumen stabilisation is a technique where you're effectively injecting water and air particles into the pavements to help create a protective mortar to then protect the pavements from flood inundation. So this is a method which is being applied in Queensland and also in New South Wales. It's a proven technique which allows for the roads to be reopened more quickly, and it means that the recovery costs aren't as high. It's not necessary to rehabilitate the roads completely compared to if it wasn't in place. So this is one measure that is being applied, and also the other measure around aerial bundle cables. So this is creating an insulation around the cables, and this can help protect the cables from debris that might be falling on the wires as a result of wind events. And this is a technique that is also being used in Victoria, and it's through our work with the returns on investment that you can see where there are some really interesting results that have come through, and some positive results for using these further.
Great, thank you, Caroline. So there's obviously some real proven solutions we've got here that go from maintenance to vegetation clearing to things like foam bitumen stabilisation and area bundle cables. What Infrastructure Victoria's research, it gives a toolkit to governments to be able to assess the highest priority risks, because we can't do everything everywhere all at once. We have a really large challenge here with the effects of climate change on our infrastructure. So there's a real opportunity for us to be focusing our investments to rebalance some of our investments so it's not all about recovery from disasters, and some of it makes us more resilient. And what our work is, it does a toolkit to assess those risks, prioritise the interventions and start to make some of them better informed by more consistent data and methods. I really commend it to you. I hope you find it really useful. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Caroline and Llewellyn, for all of their work and their contributions to today's webinar. I hope you found it really useful. Thank you for your excellent questions, and apologies for those of you who we didn't get to questions. If you've got any queries, please reach out to us, and you can find both a recording of this webinar but all of the reports and supporting technical information on Infrastructure Victoria's website right now. Thank you very much for joining us today, and I really look forward to seeing you at another event or to you tuning into a future Infrastructure Victoria webinar. Thank you and have a great day.